United States having bombed the Iranian nuclear program, Mr. Netanyahu needs to show graciousness to Donald Trump. And because Donald Trump and the Republicans are Israel's biggest supporters, he has no way of pressuring Donald Trump, and he needs the Trump administration going forward on something that is more important to him, which is the right to attack Iran if and when it seeks to rebuild its nuclear program and missile program. So for those reasons, I think there's greater room for positivity than in the past.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington today, then gearing up for his meeting with President Trump at the White House later on this evening. In the meantime, the latest round of talks between Israel and Hamas in Qatar ended without any meaningful progress. Netanyahu has said the talks with the president taking place will help advance both sides to accept a US-brokered hostage release and ceasefire deal. Let's talk to Professor Jonathan Rynhold, head of politics at Bar-Ilan University and an expert in US-Israeli relations. Professor, a very good afternoon from us. How do you feel about these talks? Are you positive about progress being made?
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. I think there's more reason to be positive than there has been at any time since the last ceasefire ended. And the reason for that is that, on the one hand, Hamas is under more pressure than it has been before to compromise because since it is losing control of handing out the aid, it is losing also its political and governance control, or at least it's weakening. And so they're under more pressure to compromise. And with the United States having bombed the Iranian nuclear program, Mr. Netanyahu needs to show graciousness to Donald Trump. And because Donald Trump and the Republicans are Israel's biggest supporters, he has no way of pressuring Donald Trump, and he needs the Trump administration going forward on something that is more important to him, which is the right to attack Iran if and when it seeks to rebuild its nuclear program and missile program. So for those reasons, I think there's greater room for positivity than in the past.
I'd like to pick up on what you said there about Hamas, and obviously we will talk about other things too, but what do you believe is left of it as an organisation?
Well, I think that they have lost the ability to put into the field a serious conventional army. I think their governance abilities, particularly in the southern half of Gaza, are very frayed, but their ability to carry out spot attacks on Israeli soldiers on the IDF remains significant. So the IDF is still some way from gaining full control of Gaza. And Hamas is weaker than it's ever been, but it's still in the game. And paradoxically, in a political sense, in some ways it's stronger because it is now seen as the address for talks on hostages and other things. And that will have implications when this eventually comes to an end.
Does Israel at the moment see eye to eye at all with America's vision of what Gaza looks like in the future?
I think America doesn't really have a clear vision. I think that Donald Trump says things at various times, not because he believes in them in a serious way, but because they're a means to pressure other parties to do something that he wants. I think that within Israel, there is no single vision for how things in Gaza should be afterwards. Israelis know what they don't want rather than what they do want. They don't want to reoccupy Gaza in the long term. They don't want Hamas to continue to control it. And they don't want the head of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, to control it. What people would like is a technocratic Palestinian government backed by moderate Arab states. But to do that, it would have to be in some way linked with the Palestinian Authority. And while, Israel in general has little problem with that, this particular government, particularly its most far right members, would see that as something that they cannot live with. And since the prime minister is dependent on them, that prevents a clear vision from being put forward by Israel.
Yep. And you mentioned politics within Israel, so important at the moment. And although a lot of people have been saying that Netanyahu is going into the White House in a very strong political position, how would you assess that voice of political opposition right now in Israel? Because it has always been there.
So, contrary to the image of Netanyahu is very strong, despite the strikes on Iran and despite the successes against the Assad regime and against Hezbollah, he remains, if elections were held tomorrow, the parties that would sit with him in a coalition remain a long way from being able to form a government. And while he's slightly ahead of the next candidate in terms of who is best suited to be prime minister, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the public don't trust him. So, I think perhaps for British listeners, the obvious example is that Winston Churchill, who was a bit of a greater leader than Netanyahu, managed to lose the 1945 election straight after the Second World War. So if he can do that, then Netanyahu better watch out as well.
When would the next election be in Israel?
The next election in Israel has to be held before October 2026. But the prime minister can call one when he wants. And once an election is called, the prime minister can't be toppled. And in Israel, it takes several months for an election to take place. So if he thought he could get normalization deals with Saudi Arabia in exchange for a ceasefire, he might risk losing the support of his far-right coalition partners, getting those deals in return for a ceasefire, and then going to the electorate.
Let's also talk, before we let you go, about Iran's nuclear programme, which of course would be on the agenda at this meeting in Washington later on this evening. When it comes to dealing with that, what realistically can be agreed between these two men? Because surely you do need a more fully international oversight on something like a nuclear programme, not just two nations.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think in the short run, the thing that Israel will be looking for is the right to use force if it sees that Iran is seeking to re-establish its nuclear weapons program or its long-range missile program, which the Americans have basically accepted if in Lebanon, if Hezbollah breaches the ceasefire, then Israel can act immediately. And that's what Israel wants. The other thing that Israel wants is that the sanctions against Iran are not dropped until there is some kind of agreement. I think that you're right that in the longer term, that Israel and America have a lot to talk about in terms of an agreement to prevent Iran reestablishing those programs. And that will almost certainly involve international organizations like the International Atomic Energy Commission. And if we're talking about snapback sanctions and things like that, then of course the members of the Security Council and other relevant parties such as Germany.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to us this afternoon. That's Professor Jonathan Rynhold, who's head of politics at Bar-Ilan University and also an expert, as we could clearly tell, in US-Israeli relations.